Hi, welcome to this final part of the commitments that President Ruto made and why they matter. I will talk about the commitments targeted towards the health and education sector and the diaspora community. My name is Susan Wanjiku. I'm the founder of Wanjikuseyeke, and here I discuss the relationship between economic development and governance so that you can understand, engage, and influence the matters that affect you and I. Welcome to Wanjikuseyeke. Now, let's begin with the health sector. Now, Ruto committed that his government will reform the National Hospital Insurance Fund, NHIF, and this includes making sure that health information systems are integrated so that patient information and their health records are easily accessible between hospitals. So even if you choose to go to Kenyatta, tomorrow Muranga, whatever, you will find your records. So he also committed to ensure that all public health facilities have adequate human resources, be it doctors, nurses, specialists, and other important workers in the health sector. Now, unfortunately, Kenya churns out many doctors. That's the fortunate part, but many end up leaving the country to go and work as a doctor in other countries, or some leave the medical practice altogether. Those are the two unfortunate scenarios. And this is because the working conditions in the medical sector are poor, and on top of that, the remuneration for the doctors in the public sector is just a joke, considering the private investment that they need to make on their own education before they can even become a doctor. So according to the World Health Organization, it's recommended that there should be at least 21 doctors and 228 nurses per 100,000 people. However, in Kenya, we have 14 doctors and 42 nurses per 100,000 people. So the implication on you is that you end up with doctors who are highly unmotivated and overworked, which sometimes translates to a misdiagnosis, poor service, long waiting lines, or lack of services kabisa. And anyway, in addition to that, he proposed that as part of the reforms, NHIF contributions will be graduated and will depend on people's income. So the standard minimum monthly contribution that one can make to NHIF is 500 Kenya shillings. Now, it may seem like a small amount, but considering that most people in Kenya work in the informal sector, that means that many will struggle to contribute this amount because it's a significant proportion of their salary. Now, if you look at this table, you can see the average monthly salary of some people in the informal sector. So for example, if we take the waitress, take 500 out of her salary, she remains with 7,000 Kenya shillings. Now imagine with that, someone still has to buy food, pay rent, transport, school fees maybe, and many other utilities. So this would explain the statistics on why we have just about 18% of Kenyans covered by NHIF, which translates to about 8.5 million Kenyans. Now, on the other hand, just 1% of Kenyans have private health insurance. However, despite the fact that 19% of Kenyans have any form of insurance, only 1 out of 12 people will be from poor households. So most households rely on their pockets, their savings or well-wishers, rather than insurance to fund their health bills. And that just means that many households are one hospital bill away from poverty. And that became so evident during the pandemic. I'm sure you or someone you know had a fundraiser, or you ended up seeing so many fundraisers, one fundraising after another, and then cases of patients being detained at hospitals because they either couldn't foot their hospital bills. Then another thing he committed to is to improve the procurement of medical supplies, which is done by the infamous KEMSA, the Kenya Medical Supplies Authority. Now, KEMSA is one among the many rotten institutions in government and has a reputation for dishing out tenders to politically connected individuals, paying suppliers who haven't actually delivered goods, and diverting stock from their warehouses. So the government pays for certain medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, and then the employees of KEMSA, and in cahoots with other business people who are private citizens, they connive and work together to steal the supplies and resell them in their businesses. Now, another issue is that when they just give tenders to politically connected individuals or some business people who are not serious, as opposed to competitive bidding, they end up buying items at very inflated prices, which when resold makes the medical supplies or pharmaceuticals very expensive, or they can't even be resold. Another thing is you will likely end up with medical supplies of low quality if you don't do competitive bidding. Then at the same time, because they have a habit of irregularly awarding tenders without the procured items being delivered, that means public hospitals and other public health facilities end up not having medical supplies. Remember, KEMSA is responsible for producing COVID millionaires, where about 8 billion Kenya shillings was meant to purchase supplies for doctors at the height of the pandemic in 2020 was irregularly spent. So there was an element of theft even if the items were procured. And then on top of that, the ones that they actually did buy were extremely inflated. So the prices were very high. And because of that, they couldn't resell the protective gear, the PPEs. And so the PPEs are just idle in the warehouse. And as a consequence, you remember doctors in public hospitals were complaining that they lacked the protective gear during the pandemic. And that means that they were just putting everyone around them at risks, themselves, other patients, and anyone around them. And even before Kenyans had a chance to recover from that scandal, mosquito nets, drugs to treat tuberculosis, and condoms disappeared from their warehouse. So reforming the health sector in Kenya is literally a matter of life and death, because for you it means that if you go to some public health facilities, you won't get medical supplies, you won't get medicine, doctors or specialists to treat you, or you could get very poor service. Then your alternative becomes the very expensive private healthcare. And even if you can afford private healthcare, it's in your best interest to want the public healthcare to function properly, because in the event of an emergency and there are no private hospitals close by, you'll still get help. And then I know the NHIF insurance is not very reliable, and I'm aware that that is a reason as to why most people, even though they are able, they don't want to contribute to the NHIF scheme. Now let's go to the education sector, and here his goal is to have the Education Reform Task Force to collect views from all players in the education sector, not just policy makers, but also to consider the views of parents, academic experts, teachers, and other relevant stakeholders. So basically to have public participation, even as they try to implement the new curriculum called the competency-based curriculum, also known as CBC, that is facing some serious resistance. So I'll discuss the importance of this public participation without getting into the technicalities of CBC. However, if you are interested in the discussions by the experts, I've put some links in the description box. Now, CBC has been the subject of debate since it was rolled out in 2020, and even when it was in trial in 2018. And a lot of the criticism comes from the fact that the push for this new curriculum seems to be coming from external forces as opposed to the curriculum reform being a locally driven process. Because why the rush? Again, if it was a locally driven process, then it would consider our unique circumstances as Kenya. They would consider the views of teachers, and they would also do a proper evaluation of the 844 curriculum. Now, unfortunately, the previous government did very little to inspire confidence in the new curriculum because they wanted to implement CBC no matter what. And anyone who attempted to ask questions about the curriculum or criticize the curriculum was dismissed, and at some point, I think some teachers were even fired for boycotting the training on CBC. And they boycotted the training because their concerns about CBC were neither being heard, neither being addressed. So basically coercion into submission, almost like what happens to doctors in this country when they protest about poor working conditions. And I think it's also happened to teachers before. But anyway, while Amina Mohammed was the CS of Education in 2018, she said that the implementation of CBC should not be rushed so that all the stakeholders are comfortable, teachers can be trained, and so that infrastructure can also be put in place to support the change into the curriculum. And I think that was probably how she found herself in the Ministry of Sports. Speculation. Anyway, so she made this recommendation after an evaluation of the pilot phase of CBC, revealed that there was a 42% successful implementation rate in the urban areas and a 13% successful implementation rate in rural areas. So success rate at both urban and rural areas was less than 50%. And the difference between the success rate in the urban areas and rural areas is wide, meaning if you proceed with CBC as it is, you will be leaving very many students behind because the system doesn't work for them. Now, CBC requires heavy involvement of the parents, especially when doing homework, and this is clearly based on many assumptions about the parents and the households that are in Kenya. For example, it assumes that all parents are educated and they can guide the children through homework. Then another assumption is that all parents have smartphones and other devices, like when they tell the students to go home and then do your research, or instances where children are required to take photos as they do certain activities at home. Then the third assumption is that parents can afford many extra materials that are required for some assignments. Then the fourth assumption is that all households have domestic help. So as the parents and the children are doing the homework, there's someone to help with the domestic chores. However, the truth of the matter is that in poor households, both the parents and the children are the source of domestic help. Yani, watoto wakitoka shule na wazazi wakitoka kazi, wanaingia kazi ingine. Kuosha nguo, kupika, some children even going to beg in the streets after school. It's just an unfortunate circumstance. Now, given those assumptions, what happens when the opposite is true? What happens to children whose parents are uneducated, have to work very late hours, or have to work overnight, or they don't even have smartphones and can't afford to spend on the other materials required to just do the homework? The economy is already tough, and there are some areas in this country that ni kama si Kenya, like I've kept saying. So what happens to the poor households? Do the kids from these households have a fair chance? And doesn't that have an impact on the assessment that will be done under this program? Won't that affect their performance? And I'm sure that is the reason why parents are a major stakeholder, obviously, and they should have been part of the discussion. and they've been complaining about being overburdened both in terms of time and money. And this is the same story when it comes to infrastructure. Kenya has some serious inequalities, so even public schools themselves across Kenya are at very different levels of advancement in their facilities, and the government has to find a way to deal with these differences as they think of implementing CBC. For example, I remember at one point in 2021, both parents and teachers were complaining that CBC is requiring too many materials to be printed and it was becoming too expensive. So Magoha, in all his wisdom, ordered that schools should use projectors if printing is too costly. And it was ridiculous because before we can even speak about using projectors, some schools are in such a horrible conditions that projectors would have no way even to project on, while other schools don't even have electricity. And those are just a few scenarios. There are many other scenarios that make projectors not a viable option. And then at the same time, teachers have barely been trained, and in the instances where there was some training, apparently even the trainers didn't understand what they were training. So all these issues explain the difference in the success rate in the rural areas and in urban areas. And because of that, it becomes very difficult to implement a new curriculum. And this is why I believe Amina Mohammed, in her right mind, said that we shouldn't rush with the process. So with all these issues, you are compromising the education outcomes of the children. And then let me tell you something. If you don't fix these issues, 10, 20 years from now, we will still be debating on whether having a degree is important, what's the highest level of education that one should have before they can run for public office. And this is because many people will have dropped out at different levels because of circumstances and reasons that don't have anything to do with intelligence, that were not factored in when creating the education system. And by the way, do you know some students fail not because they are not smart, but just because the schools that they are in don't have proper facilities. For example, the science labs don't have equipment. So how are you going to master titration and dissecting plants if you've never done it practically? And then that is what you happen to meet in exams. Then another example, if we are talking about digital and computer literacy, right now in 2022, do you know that some schools, especially the private ones, introduced this in the very early 2000s, as soon as computers became a thing in Kenya. So the people who had the privilege of being in such schools already had an upper hand by the time companies now in later on started demanding for computer literacy skills. So I've given that example to show that the differences in schools do matter. So let's encourage a level of fairness. So if the government and all other bodies that are involved in the curriculum reform process organize themselves better and consider the views of parents and teachers and the circumstances revolving around most households in Kenya, then they wouldn't face so much resistance, and they would review the entire curriculum to fit the Kenyan context. I know some people are of the view that CBC needs to be implemented as soon as possible, regardless of these issues that I've mentioned, because they believe that CBC will deal with the unemployment, or the issues don't have anything to do with them. And also they believe CBC will sort out the cramming issue. First thing, the only way to deal with unemployment, I'm sorry to tell you this, is to have the economy grow. It's not about changing the curriculum. Secondly, on the issue of cramming only comes about because of the pressure to pass exams and get a certain grade so that you can be able to get into university. So grades and passing exams becomes an obsession, because grades themselves are a filtering mechanism by the market. And why is the market filtering? Because there's a small job market with few opportunities, but there are so many people who need the jobs. So once again, it goes back to the economy. There's no way to go about this. Then we have a small job market because the economy is not growing. And please do not mention GDP to me. And to even nail my point, we've gotten to a point where some entry-level jobs in the formal sector are asking for master's degrees, and that's because it's a filtering mechanism again. So the fact is that there are many people with degrees, diplomas, and certificates who are looking for jobs. So they really need to look into the education sector because it is a mess, including universities. So thankfully, the public participation process on CBC has begun, and I really do hope that they get the concerns sorted out for the sake of the children. Now, the final issue that I believe is urgent is that Ruto has given attention to the diaspora, who are neglected and only become important when we are talking about the remittances that they make to the country. So he's committed to having a ministry for diaspora, whose role will be to strengthen diaspora services in all embassies, and to have a committee in parliament that deals with labor issues, and to set up a mechanism so that Kenyans living in the diaspora can participate in public affairs. And then another important one is that they'll work with the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, the IEBC, to enhance diaspora participation in the elections. Yani to have many of them voting. Now, this commitment is both important and timely because of the number of deaths being recorded, especially of Kenyan domestic workers in the Middle East, which has become very alarming. So we've lost about 85 Kenyans in just the last 3 months alone. And as of last year, Kenya had lost almost 100 people between 2019 and 2021. So some of these causes of death range from natural causes to death under very mysterious and inhumane circumstances. We've seen videos of Kenyan domestic workers in Saudi Arabia pleading with the government of Kenya to evacuate them and rescue them from their employers, but more often than not, the government is passive and almost acts like it's helpless. And one of the worst responses that I've seen from the government is blaming the victims. Now, funny thing is that every time a story about a domestic worker who has been tortured or died as a result of torture or committed suicide or it ends luckily was rescued, the media releases an article about the remittances that these domestic workers working in Saudi Arabia make to Kenya. Now, it might not seem like a big deal, but the psychological impact of that is that it dehumanizes these domestic workers and reduces them to a commodity, just something that can make money. Because you, as the person reading it, most people will be like, bora wanaleta pesa kwa uchumi, si mbaya sana mtoto mmoja akikufa. But isn't one person's death more than enough? How many more people need to die? So anyway, it's important to have this ministry, especially as more people look for employment opportunities abroad, and even as the government considers exporting labor as a strategy to deal with unemployment. So first of all, I think this strategy to export labor is unwise and very short-term and backward thinking, because then the government will have no incentive to fix the economy to work for everyone here, because the government knows that people will get frustrated because of unemployment and underemployment here, and they will eventually look for ways to leave the country. So what this is doing is actually promoting and enabling brain drain. such that some of the best brains in different professions, instead of choosing to work in their countries and make a professional contribution to their countries, they decide to go and work abroad. And unfortunately, this is the tragedy of Africa. Because of lack of opportunities, your hard work and effort won't always pay off. So I don't blame anyone for living at an individual level. However, a government choosing to export labor in masses means that they're sending out workers from Kenya to go and fill shortages in other countries, while us here, we have our own shortages internally. So our services here become compromised. Like last year, I remember we tried to send nurses to the UK, and then they were failing those exams, or I can't remember what those exams are called. So we wanted to export nurses to the UK, yet in our own hospitals we have a serious shortage of nurses. Then thank God the UK snapped back to its senses and withdrew the proposal, because they too understood that we have our own shortages internally. But nonetheless, every responsible government is responsible for its citizens. So anyway, I wish the new government well. Whether you voted for them or not, a win for the government is a win for all Kenyans. Wishing that the government fails, just that you can say, situliwaambia, say I told you so, is really shooting yourself in the foot, because if they fail, we all suffer. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Remember to be objective with the government. If you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, and leave a comment down below. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe. I will see you in the next one. Cheers.